Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome here. My name is Greg Rohde. I'm delighted to be here to chair this panel this morning. For those of you who were at the EENA conference last year, you may recall that one of the last sessions we had at the conference was a panel that I chaired where we discussed this particular issue that was emerging when the mobile operators, as they shut down their 2 and 3G networks, was creating some complications with respect to being able to make phone calls because of the transition into 4 and 5G networks. And so today's panel is a follow-up discussion of what we discussed last year. So what I want to do to begin is introduce Freddie McBride. Freddie McBride is going to give us an overview, and then we'll have a discussion about it. So Freddie.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Okay, so thank you, Greg. I guess the title of this session is Ensuring Seamless Emergency Communications During 2G, 3G Shutdown, and of course the transition to 4G and 5G. So Greg briefly mentioned that we had a related session at the conference last year. So for those of you not present or who cannot remember, perhaps, we'll have a little bit of a recap on the issue. So so it was on the third day of the conference last year, we had a panel, two people, chaired by Greg, and a consultant from Stratix Consulting in the Netherlands, Rudolf van der Berg. And Rudolf had raised some issues about this in a blog that he has, that some particularly roamers were having some issues with getting a voice service while traveling in the US. And then he noticed an announcement that a French mobile operator called Free, that they made. So he put some feelers out on social media asking, if anyone had experienced this issue. And he got some decent feedback, and that kind of gave him something to look at and investigate. And so this is a kind of an overview of the experience that we were seeing with roaming end users in the US. So if you imagine you get off the plane after you arrive in the US, you turn on your phone and it starts to ping, your notifications are coming through, so you're connected to the network. You won't know you have a voice service until you actually try and use voice. And of course, unless you really have to make a phone call, you might just assume you're connected, everything is fine, and move on. SMS is an interesting one. So in the feedback you got from citizens last year, this message was appearing from AT&T, which is the largest mobile carrier in the US. And you can see there, it's actually worth reading it out. Welcome, you're roaming on AT&T. Due to network technology compatibility, traditional voice calls will not work. Please use data, SMS, and app-based calling. The SMS one kind of confused us for a while. We were wondering if we don't have voice, how do we have SMS? But actually, of course, SMS can be provided over an IP connection. I'm not going to explain exactly how. But if you think about it, it is in the interest of carriers to continue to support SMS, even if it's not provided over the network in the traditional way, because it's not so much anymore for person-to-person messaging. It's used a whole lot for two-factor authentication. So it's really, really important to end users. If you make a payment on a credit card, you get an SMS. If you need to log into your accounts, you might need an authentication code. So just to let you know that I guess the reason we were seeing this happening on AT&T in 2022 was that they had shut down completely 2G and 3G. The other carriers in the US followed. I think Verizon was 2020 for 2G, 2022 for 3G. Sprint and T-Mobile also along similar timelines. And that's not an issue we really had in Europe at the time, and I'll come back to that. But after kind of an analysis of the issues, we were able to determine that the reason this was happening was due to either one or a combination of some of these issues here. So the first one is an incorrect interpretation, implementation of technical standards for VoLTE. My own view on that is that VoLTE as a service is very, very, very configurable. And if your home network and the network you're roaming on don't have a similar VoLTE profile to provide you, then you may have a problem. Another issue is varying degrees of capability of chipsets installed in handsets. This was an issue that we noticed more in the Android space rather than iOS. If you think about iOS, it's quite vertically integrated. So Apple do the hardware, the chipsets, the software. Apple devices are also quite high-end in terms of their capability. The Android market's a bit different. You have independent OEMs who all use the Android operating system. They source their own chipsets. They target their devices at certain segments of the market. So it's a lot harder to pinpoint what works and what doesn't work. And it was actually interesting last year. Rudolph gave an example of two almost identical looking at Samsung handsets, and one of them worked okay and the other didn't. The other issue was some kind of an incompatibility between for support for IPv4 and IPv6 in networks and handsets. Anecdotally, we know this was an issue on one network in the US, and with some sort of informal discussions and intervention between the FCC and that operator, the issue was resolved quite quickly. The other issue was those VoLTE roaming agreements to support 4G voice between networks. And actually, even since last year, more VoLTE roaming agreements have been put in place, and they will continue to be put in place. So we'll start to see the same level of coverage and compatibility that we've been used to on 2G and 3G for a long time now. And then last but not least, when you don't have a 2G or 3G network to fall back on, you will not be able to make an emergency call. And this is quite interesting because if that piece is in place, and I'm talking here only about emergency calls now, not having a voice service in general. If you still have 2G or 3G access, you should still be able to make a voice call to 112, even if you have all of the other issues present. That's an important point to make. So last summer, when we were a little bit quieter after the conference, we started to do some advocacy activities in the EENA to raise awareness of this issue. So we wrote to 31 telecoms regulators in Europe. We wrote to the Commission, ETSI. We wrote to the FCC, to some of the industry representative bodies, the GSMA, MVNO Europe, Digital Europe, ETNO, ECTA, and to BEUC, who's a European consumer representative body. And we had two objectives in our outreach to these organizations. In the short term, we wanted to ensure that their members raise awareness with their customers that if you are traveling, you may have this issue. And when you're aware of it, you might be able to do something about it, rather than having a surprise when you need to make an emergency call and you can't do it. And then in the longer term, it's really important that we get this resolved, because when 2G and 3G is gone, and that safety net of circuit switch fallback is gone in Europe. So we've seen the issue of European roamers in the US, but in Europe we still rely on circuit switch fallback for almost all emergency communications. It's implemented in every country. And we're starting to move away from that now, but this is just a screenshot I took on my device when I landed in Slovenia on Sunday evening. And this is common. I've been doing this since last year. Anytime I go to a country, I just see what's available. And you can see that, and this is typical, to see three providers. In this case, I think there's a fourth provider offering 4G. But all of the providers still have 2G, 3G, and 4G. So still have 2G and 3G as well as 4G. So if you have that, even if you have some issue with 4G voice, you will be able to make an emergency call. But since last year, a lot of European operators have been announcing their plans to switch off 2G and 3G. 3G first seems to be the plan in Europe. We do have a lot of like cellular-based IoT, relying on 2G, smart metering, e-call, services like that. I feel like a legacy support plan will need to be put in place before some of these services are shut down. So in terms of the stakeholder engagement, just to give you some, I suppose, initiatives that have been developed since we started our advocacy activities last summer. So Ofcom, the telecoms regulator in the UK, in February, they published a document entitled 3G and 2G Switch Off, Our Expectations from Mobile Providers. And in that document, they raised the issue that we raised about ensuring continuity of emergency services during the shutdown. But they also raised a really, really important issue about equivalent levels of coverage on 4G and 5G that we have on 2G and 3G. If any of you were here yesterday morning, I mentioned that this has been a really important issue because when we rolled out 2G and 3G, a lot of the license conditions had geographic coverage. The 4G licenses and the 5G licenses predominantly had more, leaning towards more population coverage. And of course, geographic coverage is absolutely essential for emergency services. Also, BEREC, the body of European regulators for electronic communications, they have an item in their work program for this year that will be adopted at the final BEREC plenary in Q4. It's a report on practices and challenges of the phasing out of 2G and 3G, and the emergency services access will be part of this report as well. Two other very interesting initiatives. The GSMA is developing an emergency VoLTE roaming specification, and ETSI is preparing a network interoperability test description for emergency services over VoLTE. And we do have the GSMA and ETSI representatives on the panel today, and so we will hopefully learn more about those initiatives. Back to you, Greg. Thanks.
Thank you, Freddie. Really appreciate that. So with us today is Ian Pannell, who is with the GSMA Association. And as Freddie just outlined, which was consistent with what we discussed last year, that there's not a single point of failure here. There seems to be a number of things that are causing this problem, whether it be handsets, roaming agreements, maybe a standard issue. So maybe, Ian, you could give us your perspective as to what's the origins of this problem that we're dealing with now.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, and just for those who aren't aware of who the GSMA are, we are a trade association stroke pseudo standards organization. We're not a recognized standards organization in Europe, but we do create standards. And indeed, we were the original body that created the GSM standards and then handed them off to other bodies to manage in the longer term. In terms of what's happened here is you have to go back quite a while, actually, to understand what's happening. And the transition between 3G and 4G in 3GUP, in the standardization world, they made a decision to remove voice and messaging services from the 3GP specifications, the core specifications. Up till then, all of the iterations of the mobile standards had included those two core services as part of the standards, but the transition to 4G, LTE, they didn't. They said it's just a service. Voice is just a service that runs over the network. I can understand why they did it, because at the point in time, they were being shouted at with everything louder than everything else. They wanted it faster, they wanted the next technology to be faster, more spectral efficiency, better mobility management, blah, blah, blah. Lots and lots of features that meant that uplift from 3G to 4G was quite a big uplift in terms of technology standards. It was quite a big change. And therefore they didn't do the whole hog and carry on with the voice services. They had IMS as a 3GP standard, as a service delivery platform, so that they believed the problem was sort of addressable. But this is when I started working on this and joined the GSMA. We realized that actually there was more needed. So we actually defined the VoLTE standards in GSMA. So VoLTE is specified in GSMA, but GSMA standards are voluntary. They are not mandated by any organization, and therefore we define the voice standards. I would slightly disagree with Freddie's slide about the causes. I wouldn't say it's incorrect implementation of the standards. It's just that the standards are so wide that you can implement them and be correct and be quite different to another operator or another handset OEM. And that's the cause of the problem. That sort of that scale of difference between the implementations that are still standards compliant leaves a lot of end user experience problems for the voice service in particular. And so what happened was the chipset manufacturers, because this goes right down into the chipsets. It's not just the handset OEMs integrating components together, but the chipset manufacturers, the handset manufacturers all said, this is quite difficult. We're implementing handsets, but we will know that circuit switch fallback will still exist for a long time. So we can build 4G handsets and actually not worry about voice, because the 3G capability will still be there, or 2G capability will still be there, and we can go for circuit switch fallback.
So in other words, the 4G standard, LTE standard, was created with in mind of a fallback to 2 and 3G.
It was certainly known that it was there, and LTE, you're going back well over 10 years. And for 10 years, we've been going along with circuit switch fallback, and then suddenly people are going, hang on, we need that spectrum. We need to evolve. We can't afford to keep running an additional network every time the technology evolves, because at the moment, the networks are running 2G, 3G, 4G, and now 5G networks. That's 5 networks they're managing with all the power that consumes, all the operational resource that consumes, and security. Managing the security, particularly on those earlier generations, is a big overhead. So it's quite natural that the networks want to optimize.
Great. Well, maybe we can turn to Boštjan Pintar, who is involved with ETSI and the standards. So maybe you can share with us a little bit about how is ETSI looking at this now, and all the standards bodies looking at this from a standards perspective.
Well, at least currently at ETSI, at the European Telecommunication Standardization Institute, I'm involved in the testing task force 010, and actually this is a testing task force which is dealing with VoLTE interoperability test specifications, preparation of VoLTE interoperability test specifications for emergency services, specifically for emergency call and eCall, next generation eCall. Actually, this testing task force started in last year in September, and it will end this year in November, probably, if everything goes okay. And if yes, then the standards, testing standards, interoperability testing standards will be published in approximately 2 months. Actually, we on this TTF, we are working 6 experts, and yes, the main objective of the testing task force 10 is preparation of multi-part standard. Actually, 3 parts of standard. The first standard will be test purposes, the second will be test descriptions, and the third one, abstract test suite. And maybe to go to the first one, test purpose document will cover test purposes for specific interfaces in the network, and then those test purposes will be referenced from the test description document, from the test descriptions, tests, which will be written in a way to cover different functionalities, to cover, for example, attachment, registration, then initiation of the call, then also release of the call and the attachment. We will try to cover also different situations of home or visited network, and to take care maybe in the way to prepare tests also if the user equipment does contain a USIM card or does not, because it's also possible to perform emergency call without USIM card. So yeah, we will try to prepare a set of those tests, and maybe quickly to highlight how such test description look like. For example, it's composed from 3 parts. First part is the tabular form, which contains really unique test identifier related to the functionality, and then there is test objective and references, test steps, and also test purposes from the first part of the standard. The second part of the test would contain message sequence charts, which will be then in the third part also explained what kind of messages are exchanged and so on. So the idea is really to prepare those test descriptions, which will be useful for network testing. And in the third part of the standardization, there is abstract test suite where we need to develop TTC-entry code. This is a language where we can actually develop those test purposes and test descriptions. So altogether, we can then use at some plug tests, for example. Plug test trademark is registered by ETSI, and maybe a few words about plug test. Plug test actually is a testing event which is organized by ETSI. For example, last year we had a next generation eCall second plug test. The first one was 3 years ago. It was a remote plug test event due to the COVID situation. Last year we had this next generation event, and yeah, it was organized here in Kranj in Slovenia. Maybe.
So let's assume that you're successful in the standards bodies and revisiting the standard and trying to solve this. What's the time frame that, let's assume you address the standards issues and you come up with a new standard. How long does it take for the operators to start implementing this? I mean, what kind of time frame are you looking at here, even if you're successful with what you're working on?
Well, I think the best way is really to prepare such testing standards, and then plug test is really
How long is that period then?
Just for preparation of the standard, you think, or?
For the whole period. So you address the standards issue, you do the plug test, let's say all that is successful.
Yeah, usually.
And then how long until the operators are actually
Let me try and help. We've looked at a range of things that need to be done, not purely the testing, but also the specifications, the encouragement you have to give to the industry to resolve the issue. And perhaps that's something, the GSMA is fundamentally an operator-based association, right, although we have lots of handset manufacturers who also participate in the work we do. And we have, when we, after the EENA notification, we went round our members and said, look, guys, we got this problem, we need to fix it. And everyone said, yeah, absolutely. There's a strong will across the whole industry to resolve this issue. The timescales differ by region because of the local regulatory policy around 2G, 3G closure. or the provision of ongoing services related to safety in particular. And also there's a different regulatory sort of views on emergency services and how emergency services are delivered, and which is why we saw what happened in North America happen in North America. But what we are doing on the standard side is that we publish is putting in the expectation, or we expect handsets and networks to be doing in an environment where it's packet switched services only, i.e. 4G and 5G, what the handset needs to be doing, what the network needs to be doing, and we're sort of documenting that to make sure it's quite clear to everybody what needs to happen when these circumstances arise. What we are also doing is documenting the different scenarios that can arise, because as networks and handsets have evolved, some of the early 4G handsets weren't as capable as some of the later 4G handsets or even the 5G handsets. So we've mapped out the different categories of handsets, whether they're voice-centric or data-centric, whether they've got IMS inbuilt capability or they need IMS downloaded, and worked out what we can expect from the different combinations of the handsets and networks, such that we can advise on policies. Because for some 4G handsets, it won't ever be possible to make a VoLTE emergency call. And therefore, for those limited handsets, it will have to be a swap out.
Sure.
At some point in time. So we're doing all of that to sort of help manage that through. But that is going to have to cover the life cycle of a device, the churn of devices. People won't necessarily want to buy new handsets next September when the test specs are published, for example. So
yeah, every September when Apple comes out with the new handset, everyone wants a new one, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You get one 2 years old, you're ancient. Right? Yeah. To what degree are roaming agreements play into this? I mean, is there something going on with your roaming agreements as we've moved into 4 and 5G?
There is, because of the prevalence of circuit switch fallback. There was never the pressure to implement roaming agreements on VoLTE. So even those networks that implemented VoLTE for their home subscribers, there was never that pressure to implement VoLTE roaming agreements for travelers. And VoLTE roaming is just as complex as the problems, the complexity of VoLTE when you go into roaming scenarios makes this problem significantly worse to such an extent that you can't test your way out of it. You have to test test a handset against a network for the home situation, and that's you get 200-300 VoLTE capable handsets coming out a year in one network, so that's 200 or 300 tests per network. And then each network has hundreds of roaming agreements, and you have to have interoperability not just between the home network and the handset, between the home network, the handset, and the visited network. Yeah. And so you've got 200 or 300 times 200 or 300 times 200 or 300.
Very complicated.
That doesn't scale through testing.
Sure.
You have to resolve the interoperability.
Yeah. So Freddie, I remember last year the message that came out of the discussion we had was an outreach to regulators to say, hold on, please tell the operators not to shut down 2, 3G networks. That's not a solution, that's a delay. But what do you see happening now? What's the message to regulators as we deal with this very complex problem? As we're hearing, it's there's not a single solution to it. It's going to take a while. So where do we go from here?
Well, I suppose first of all, I would say that when we did outreach to regulators last year, actually everybody that we did outreach to was incredibly supportive and acted very fast to address the short-term issue, raise awareness. I was in a few regulator meetings afterwards and got confirmation that they had contacted the operators in their home country, they had told them about the issue and instructed them to raise awareness of it, and they had done that. They even went to investigate how they would be impacted looking at the roaming agreements they had with operators in the United States. So this was really good. That so what you have to remember is, from a regulator's point of view, access to emergency services is a requirement. So their view on it would be quite black and white in terms of going forward. At the moment, with fallback, I suppose the access is guaranteed, right? But when it's gone, particularly in Europe, because we have lots of small countries, lots of national borders, that circuit switch fallback plays a key role because a lot of the time, even when you have a 4G voice service, you make an emergency call, it dials, or you cross a border, you don't get full connectivity because there might be a roaming agreement in place. You still have emergency calls only access to any network that has 2G or 3G. So I think as long as that's there, the regulators are going to be aware of it, but it's not going to become a huge problem for them. But they do recognize the need to be proactive and follow what's happening in the work that's been done in the GSMA and what's happening in ETSI as well, because and actually Boštjan and I had just a little chat before we came on stage here talking about, well, what could potentially happen in the future to ensure that this works. It is possible that there could be an intervention at a European level to ensure perhaps maybe that the handsets or even elements of the network infrastructure meet certain certification requirements, if you like, before they can be sold on the market. So I'm kind of speculating here about that. I think at the moment the industry is working hard to resolve it, and the extent of future regulatory intervention will probably depend on how successful the industry is at resolving the problem.
Are you seeing a lot of international cooperation on this issue? I mean, you highlighted that it really popped up with Europeans traveling to the United States, and suddenly, wham! They couldn't make a voice call. Yeah. Is there good cooperation between U.S. regulators and European regulators, and for that matter, with Asia and the rest of the world? Are you seeing this cooperation occur?
We have. I wouldn't say I'm outside of. We've seen the issue in the US, so we reached out to the FCC. We had calls with the FCC. We know that BEREC has a relationship with the FCC, and this would be on their agenda. The fact that the regulators themselves are actually publishing documents now that their regulated entities have to take account of is a good thing. I have to say the FCC have been very supportive. We, as EENA, have an open dialogue with them on this issue. And I think that in terms of that short-term issue of awareness raising, it's been effective. But as I say, I think the spotlight's now on the industry to find solutions, and let's see how that plays out. But if we start to get to the point where these shutdown plans we're reaching those deadlines and we still don't have a solution, then I think that more formal regulatory intervention might be necessary.
Sure. One of the issues that was brought up last year by Rudolf Edinburgh was he made the accusation, if you will, that because of some of the ambiguities in the standards, that he thought that some of the bigger operators were potentially blacklisting certain devices, blacklisting certain networks, and using business practices, if you will, to complicate the problem. Do you have a perspective on that? Do you think there's any truth to that, or is it just a speculation on this part?
I would put this slightly different because of this divergence across because of as you say the wide range of implementation of these standards. It was difficult to predict, as I said, the user experience in all cases, and so you find chipset manufacturers in particular take a lot of the brunt of this because they're the ones who have to implement the code that handles the microcode that handles divergence across the different networks. And they sometimes have to go to the level of actually putting network-specific code inside their chipsets. So baseband processors and modems and things like that. I think what then happens is that you get blocking from the chipsets saying, well, I'm not going to support that network until I've tested this chipset on it. And then the OEMs will say, well, we'll follow on and sort of stack that up. And the operators, in particular with VoLTE roaming agreements, will say, I'm not going to support VoLTE in networks where I haven't done the testing either, because I, as a network, am reliant on other networks for their implementation to make sure this all works. But I do need to emphasize that in the case of emergency calls, the VoLTE roaming agreement isn't necessarily the blocker. Because for an emergency call to happen, you don't need to be a registered visitor on that network with a VoLTE roaming agreement in place. The packet switch emergency call capability, which is still VoLTE, but it's an anonymous connection. You have a SIM card there, but so the handset doesn't have to register on the VoLTE.
So in some cases, there could be an emergency call as possible, but not a regular voice call?
Absolutely, exactly. Yes, yeah, okay. Precisely.
Right.
Well interpreted.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any questions from the audience? Anybody have any questions they want to ask? Yes. You.
Good morning. Good morning. Thanks for the discussion. Very interesting. So my name's Mark Bingley from Denso Automotive. You've been making a lot of discussion here for handsets, and I was interested from an automotive perspective. There are maybe 1 million new vehicles sold each week in the EU. Each one of those is mandated to have 2G, 3G eCall. Now, I know this is something which the European Commission and I think probably EENA were also looking at, but are you able to explain what's the way forward for this at the moment? Mm-hmm. So there are some options. I'm not sure of the actual status. Do you have any recommendations, and how has the EENA been helping with this?
Yeah, excellent question about eCall.
You have first and I'll go.
Yeah. Okay, well, given you mentioned EENA, I will go. I guess we probably would have got to this in the discussion, but I'm glad you raised it anyway. And I did mention the BEREC work, and they plan to look at the impact of this issue on permanent roaming. And I know that a lot of IoT, if you like, on mobile networks uses it on a kind of permanent roaming basis. You source your numbering resources from one entity. So the connectivity is kind of, enabled in the factory. You sell the device anywhere in the world, and it connects to the network based on roaming, and then might stay in that country on a permanent roaming basis. So, and of course, eCall, because it's a mandatory requirement in the EU, and since 2018 we've been rolling cars off production lines with this capability, and it refers specifically to a standard that you need to implement, and that's, as our questioner asked here, as he mentioned, it's 2G, 3G is what's in that standard. So there are millions of cars out there now that have 2G, 3G eCall, and when we turn off 2G and 3G, they will no longer have support. There's a session later this afternoon on next generation eCall. Boštjan will be participating in that. And the European Commission at the moment is looking at how they will move to eCall over IMS. And part of that regulatory amendment or update is looking at how we will ensure legacy support for a certain period of time afterwards. So I suppose at some point when cars roll off the production line, the standard that they'll have to meet will be based on 4G, 5G, and not 2G, 3G. But we need to support the vehicles that are out there. So how do you do that? So some of the options. So the commission, they commissioned a study with an independent consultant. That work is ongoing at the moment. I think it's a little bit delayed, and so we have no idea yet what the proposals will be with respect to ensuring, how we ensure legacy support. But I can tell you some of the options that are being, let's say, talked about. One was that we would have some kind of 2G network of last resort. As a former regulator, when I hear this, and I'm sure if there's any regulators in the room, that's like a really challenging thing to do, because you're creating a monopoly, basically, where you've been for the last 20 years trying to break monopolies. What would be the parameters for using this network? Who's going to provide it? Which operator are you going to select to provide the 2G network of last resort? So I don't know how that would work, but to me it seems that there are more challenges with it than the solutions it would provide.
Well,
and just one more thing, Greg. Yeah. The other solutions are all around retrofitting, okay? And the problem with retrofitting is that the question that comes straight after retrofitting is who's going to pay for it? Are the car manufacturers going to pay for it? If I own a car, am I going to pay for it? So it's very hard to say what's going to happen. But we're kind of hoping, maybe based on some kind of anecdotal, informal information, that the proposal from the Commission would be published by the end of this year. So we might know more then.
Well, as you know, one of the complexities dealing with e-call is that the automobile manufacturers need a lot of lead time before they change the technology in their car. Yeah. So they're usually looking at about a 5-year window. So once you figure out what the solution is, you've got a long time before automobiles will start to catch up with that solution by introducing, new technology, whatever the solution might be. So that's an excellent question.
But I think there's a couple of important points within that. I agree with Freddie about the scenarios and the choices being made. I do think that this sort of 2G network of last resort isn't such a bad thing as a former regulator might think of. And indeed, it's some of it's the routes that have been taken by other regulatory authorities outside Europe. What I think is important to consider is, there's two problems here. There's the legacy, and then there's how do you regulate this in the future? Because I think one of the lessons from eCall is that maybe the regulation was too specific, technology specific. Mm-hmm. And if you didn't tie it down to a technology, but tied it to a service, you may get a better outcome. And I think that's an important thing to take forward as well. And indeed, also in this whole, evolving to 4G, 5G, 6G, whenever that happens, for emergency calls. So I'd encourage the regulatory people to think about service rather than technology when thinking about these problems.
So, for example, requiring some kind of a standard or a requirement for emergency services, whether it comes from eCall, whether it comes from a cell phone, right, going forward?
Whatever device that needs to be capable of making an emergency call should have the specifications or the regulations should make it clear what's expected of it in terms of the service rather than the technology.
Sure, good point. The gentleman behind you had a question? Oh, same one. Okay. Who else? Up there?
Good morning, Stephen Hines from London. A lot of victims of domestic violence will hold a second or hidden phone, and these are often going to be older handsets and almost exclusively on pay-as-you-go SIMs for the obvious reason they can't have a bill landing on the letterbox for the phone they don't have. Is this a population that has been completely forgotten in this, that they will have a phone they rely on in an emergency that next year won't work?
I'm thinking this is very much a policy issue, in particular around things like SIM-less or SIM-required emergency calling, which is why some countries allow seamless emergency calls. In terms of the technology, that will evolve. But I think in terms of the policy decisions around whether seamless emergency calls are capable, I think that's one of the strong arguments for allowing it.
Yeah. Okay. If I may just add to that, Greg, one of the general issues that needs to be taken into account, and indeed Ofcom addressed it in their paper, is citizen awareness of what's happening and requirements on regulated stakeholders to ensure that they consult with their customers to make sure that they are aware that at some point on some date these devices are no longer going to work. So there's an element there that has to be taken into account. Consumer engagement on this is really, really important issue.
Yeah.
Another question? So maybe this is for you, Freddie, or maybe Ian. Today, can you give people assurance that they can still make an emergency call? Has this been at least, has the dam been stopped a little bit so that the problem won't emerge, today?
I'll start, and I'm sure Freddie will finish. So what Rudolph and EENA did last year was really great in raising the awareness. I mean, it was always going to be, somehow it was going to bubble up to the top when these network closures were going to happen. It's something the industry hadn't faced before because, as I said, previous generations, the voice service was specified in a mandated specification, which therefore you couldn't have, these incompatibilities would never have arisen. So we've got awareness now. We've got all of particularly the network operators, who are the people who are pushing and driving for the ability to close down the 2G and 3G networks. They're much more aware of this situation now than they were before. So it is very much in focus. So I'm not going to predict anything, but I would certainly hope that we wouldn't see the sort of the alarmist situation that sort of came up last year re-emerging.
Okay.
Yep, I'd agree with what Ian says, but I suppose the only thing to say on it is as long as 2G and 3G is still around in any way, shape or form, we can be ensured that at least calls to 112 will work. And when we'll see the issues when they're turned off, unless we have, I do think Ian is right, there's a focus on it now. We're seeing the industry acting. We're seeing regulators, raising awareness through policy documents. I think that this is really, really, really helpful development. But
Right.
It's a big problem to resolve.
Yeah, okay. Boštjan, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, at least hopefully, I think that with some testing, the issue can be somehow resolved. But anyway, we can maybe also compare the testing with the blood samples, for example. If we take a blood sample, we can measure the blood sample and we can take some parameter, but we cannot check all parameters in the blood. So it's also the same thing with the testing. So it means you need to perform a lot of testing, interoperability testing, conformance testing, to really ensure that the product is somehow conformity to the standard. And of course, with such plug tests, for example, we can get really feedback to the standardization body to improve the standards and so on. And on the other hand, the participants, vendors, operators can get also somehow feedback to fix the bugs and to prepare for the next generations, for example.
Terrific, yeah. Ian, do you have any final thoughts? We've covered a lot of ground, yes.
Yeah. I think we've covered most of what I was trying to say. I think the industry really is committed to resolving this issue. We haven't. I've tried to stack away in my brain, all of the things that's going on just inside the GSMA on this issue, and we haven't covered them. You could go on for another hour, and I'd still be talking. So we are doing a lot, not just in our specifications that we publish, but in services that we offer. We offer similar, not identical, but similar testing services and certification services for networks and for devices to help resolve the issue. We're doing things with encouraging the key stakeholders in the business to help resolve the issue as well. So hopefully, as I said a few moments ago, we won't see the sort of panic scenario that could have arisen last summer.
Right. Well, before I turn it to you, Freddie, for last word, let me just say I've over the years seen a number of issues emerge, and watch EENA engage with all this, and EENA should be congratulated for identifying an issue, raising it, and look at how immediate the response was with industry and regulators to respond to it. So it was a great move by EENA. EENA deserves credit for highlighting an issue. You had somebody like Rohde who was looking at this, and EENA grabbed it right away. So congratulations on that, and thank you for that. But do you have any last word here?
I think it's been said. I think from EENA's perspective, the engagement that we got from all of the stakeholders we contacted was really, really encouraging. There was, a collective momentum, if you like, to try and resolve the issue, raise awareness in short term, and now we're seeing the efforts being made by ETSI and GSMA and others in the regulatory side as well to put a focus on resolving it long term, and it's encouraging.
Terrific. Okay, thank you all very much.